Welcome to Midweek Musing for Wednesday the 15th of July. One of the things I've been watching closely over the last few days is the changing position that scientists and government ministers seem to be having about the wearing of face coverings in shops and other public places. I was particularly interested as, in many ways, depending on what they said, would affect what we would say to people as we were thinking about the question of reopening church buildings, whether it was something we would ask them to do or not. And over the weekend, there was a clear message that wearing face coverings was a very good thing to do. Everybody in positions of leadership and authority seemed to be recognising that it was good in public places to wear them. And in fact, there's been a recommendation since the middle of May that people do that. But there was less clear messaging, maybe going back to what we were thinking about last week, less clear messaging about whether it was simply going to be recommended or a legal requirement. But now we know that from Friday the 24th of July, it will be a legal requirement to wear face coverings of some sort in shops. Not clear yet when I recorded this, whether that's going to apply to other public places. And this led me to start wondering about when it's necessary to command something, or when you can reasonably expect people to make the right decisions if they have the right information, or whether you simply want to ask people to do something and leave it up to them what they decide. Clearly, the government decided it was necessary to move from a position of expecting people to do something because it was the right thing to actually ordering them to do so. And I wonder how much attention we pay to these differences when reading the Bible or thinking about how we operate as church together. We're going to look at two different examples from Ephesians to explore this idea. They're right next to each other. One's in Ephesians 4:32 at the end of that chapter, and then the other is in chapter 5, verses 1 and 2. In 4:32, Paul seems to be telling the believers exactly what they should do. This is what he wants them to do. It says this: be kind and compassionate to one another, forgiving each other, just as in Christ God forgave you. He's calling on them to act caringly and kindly towards each other, to forgive each other for any hurt or suffering they have caused. And he wants them to do it to the same extent that God has forgiven them. It's a big thing that Paul is telling them. And it's difficult to look at that verse and see any space to hide, any basis to say, this does not apply to me. Paul was speaking to somebody else. I don't understand why this applies. But the next two verses seem to be different. This is what they say: follow God's example, therefore, as dearly loved children, and live a life of love, just as Christ loved us and gave himself up for us as a fragrance offering and sacrifice to God. Here, Paul seems to be wanting them to understand what God has done, what Jesus has done, and for their lives to be different because of that realization. Because God has loved us and welcomes us as the children he dearly loves. Because Jesus loved us and sacrificed himself for us. Because of those things, we ought to love each other. So for this to change our behaviour, we need to recognise what God has done. We need to understand the need to change because of it. So it's much more left up to us to understand the situation and to act accordingly. In the context of COVID-19, and maybe slightly misquoting Michael Gove, it's about relying on people's common sense to understand the situation and to do the right thing. Or thinking about bringing up young children. Sometimes it's necessary to tell them what to do, particularly when they're younger. When they get older, we often try to explain to them why a certain behaviour is best. Here, Paul seems quite happy to switch between one and the other. Did he see one as more important? Did he think the reasons for one was easier for people to grasp? Or am I making this up and there's really no distinction at all? Here's some questions to think about. Do you prefer to be told what to do, or for the reason to be explained to you? How do you respond to each method? What does this say about good models of leadership? And what implications, if any, does that have for how we are church together?